to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats.
Thank you, Kathy. My pleasure to be with you again.
So you want to tell us just a few opening comments about our topic today, which is avoiding the pitfalls of utopia.
Yeah, we have to remember that when we talk a lot about, well, how does the Constitution work? How does it relate to these other issues, which are good things to talk about? We have to remember that ultimately the Constitution was a very practical project. And the people that gathered in Philadelphia were trying to deal with actual problems that they perceived that they had lived through under the Articles of Confederation. There are a lot of critiques that were made at the time about about whether or not the Constitution was sufficiently Republican for people's tastes, and people would cite to various authors to critique features of the Constitution. But again, the people that gathered at Philadelphia were trying to deal with an actual problem. And when you read, for example, the Federalist Papers in support of the Constitution, the writers repeatedly refer to, hey, we're doing the best we can here trying to deal with this. And yes, some of these things might not fit this theory or that, but the Constitution wasn't written by a bunch of people in the faculty lounge at the local law school. The Constitution was written by people who were well versed in classical understandings of constitutions and political theory, but trying to adapt those concepts that they had thought about and that they believed were important in a Republican form of government, trying to adapt them to the realities of the situation. As you know from the project we've been working on this year, what is a republic is up to considerable interpretation, and ultimately it comes down to how these things function. And so we have to deal with that, right? We have to, if we're the framers in Philadelphia, we have to deal with the fact that there are small states who are very suspicious about Virginia and Pennsylvania taking over the place because they have the greatest wealth and the greatest population. At the same time, we have people from Virginia who are very concerned about basically having these small states, Georgia and Delaware, carrying a majority of the votes, as they had done under the Articles of Confederation. So they have to compromise. They have to structure things in relation to how the system, what's best for the people of the United States at that point in time. And you see that running through the Federalist Papers again and again, where Madison and Hamilton talk about the importance of experience in shaping what they did here, rather than some sort of theoretician somewhere. One of the big, great examples is in Federalist 10. Let me just pull this up quickly. Where Madison is critiquing the notion that the system is not sufficiently sensitive to democratic with a small d concerns. And he dismissively, almost contemptuously refers to theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government, have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. So that brings up another point that relates to this notion of, this is a practical project, not an exercise in the faculty lounge. And that is the framers' view of human nature. That human nature is not this sort of idealized, optimistic conception of humanity in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, but that we need to deal with the way things really are. And you get a real sense of that in Federalist 51, where Madison addresses what government really is about and why you need government. And it's not enough to be talking about the virtue of the people or how great human nature is. He says, how do you deal with the dangers of concentration of powers in the same person or department? He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? There's this hypothetical, well, you know, people are virtuous. So no, they're not, says Madison, because then you would need government. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Just as the people aren't angels, much the less the rulers are likely to be angels. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Obliging in that sense actually meant forcing. The ought at that time was interpreted as a must. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control of the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions, right? They had no illusions about the sort of idealist conceptions of human nature or about rulers. This idea that virtue will be the only thing that we need. We have a virtuous people, and we get virtuous rulers. We can train them to virtue. Right? Plato's Republic is not reality, as far as the framers are concerned. So it's important to remember that the very healthy skepticism about utopian schemes. And we should always be careful about utopian schemes. I hear utopian schemes where I work not infrequently. And so I myself am quite skeptical of these kinds of things personally.
Well, thank you for that. And you know, what I'm taking from that is the founders were realists, and they realized they were dealing with real people and real situations, and then tried to construct the best constitution that they could for that.
And to get this adopted, right? So we criticize a lot. Well, they didn't get rid of the institution of slavery. Well, at the time the Constitution was written, almost every state allowed slavery. And to create, to have really put their foot down, even if they'd wanted to, had, you know, given some of their, you know, at least leanings that they had wanted to, it would have torn it apart. So they needed to keep their eye on the prize.
But they gave mechanisms to get rid of it. And I think looking forward, they anticipated getting rid of it.
Sure.
You know, I wanted to ask, I think you and I talked a little bit about this in a pre-show conversation about Thomas More's Utopia, and if that had any, and just what some of the other writings that dealt with utopian thought, if that had any sort of influence on the founders. And you had mentioned a few works even besides Thomas More's Utopia. What would you have any comments on that?
Sure. Look, a lot of the framers were very well educated, and to the extent that they think there are stories about Madison reading up on the classics in anticipation of the convention, things that maybe he hadn't known, people borrowing books from other people's libraries. So they were generally quite well versed in the classical writers, and you know, there had been idealist conceptions of government going back at least to Plato, probably before then, Plato's Republic. But it's never clear whether Plato's books like this were warnings or were sort of recipes for how to ideally do things. And Thomas More, in writing Utopia, was engaged in satire and was basically lampooning this idea of creating a perfect society, although he was, through the book, also seeking to critique, to some extent, raise some questions about prevalent modes of thinking at the time. But what's interesting, one just aside, what's interesting about Thomas More, he coined the word utopia as it's spelled there. Utopia comes from the Greek word for topos, for place. And when you have the EU in front of it, that version of utopia, the EU meant an ideal or perfect place. But when you drop off the E and just have the U in front of it, the U in front of it, the way he spelled it, in Greek, putting the U in front of it meant no place. So it's a big pun in that sense. We pronounce in English, the Greeks didn't pronounce it the same way, but we in English pronounce EU-topia and utopia the same way. So there's the pun, right? That there is no perfect place in that sense. So he's lampooning this idea of creating these sort of perfect places. And he's not the only one, right? Back when after Plato was writing, you get people like Aristophanes writing the play The Clouds, and he's lampooning Socrates, the philosopher with head in the cloud floating slightly off the ground. You have Voltaire much more recently than even Thomas More lampooning this Enlightenment idea that we can create through sort of philosophical optimism these perfect societies. And everybody had an opinion, philosopher had an opinion about the perfect society, starting with certain assumptions, self-evident truths. And Voltaire lampooned that in his work Candide. So these philosophers coming up with these ideal places, and then people turning around and having fun at their expense, recognizing that the world doesn't work that way, has been a game going on for a couple of millennia now.
Well, and that is fascinating about the history of the word utopia. I'd never heard that before, that on one hand, it can mean perfect place, and very closely related, it can mean no place. That is really interesting. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Tova because I know she's got some great questions, and then we'll go on to Jewel. And Professor Knipprath actually has to leave at about 5 till the hour today. So I just wanted to let everybody know that because we want to be sure to get to some audience questions too before the professor has to leave. So Tova, I'm going to let you take it away here.
Great, thank you. I'll try to keep it slightly shorter because I know I always have so many questions that I take up time with. But to start, I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between like utopianism versus just more optimism or idealism. Like what differentiates the two, or is it just a matter of labeling?
To me, it's a very good question. To me, it's basically a level of it's labeling. To me, idealism. There's a whole branch of philosophy, idealism, which is not what we're really talking about here. But this idea that yes, people are good, people can be taught these things, and we can all create a paradise, Eden on earth. That's to me is an idealistic view of things, and certainly there have been various permutations, I say, by writers throughout history. We've only scratched the surface here in my few remarks here. But it tends to become utopian. And then when people actually try to create these utopian societies, as Madison points out and as well alludes to in Federalist 10, this typically turns into disaster. Pol Pot had an idealized view of how things should work in Cambodia, a utopian society. But that's not, it leads to serious problems because some people won't go along with this. And now what are we going to do? Are we going to force them to go along? These are sort of the hoarders and wreckers. Plato ran into that issue in the Republic a couple of thousand years ago. So I don't see much difference between. And so it's one thing to say, look, we ought to try for these kinds of things. But then when we start to do it in a collective sense, rather than individually trying to be better, we typically run into social problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess pretty much everyone in history always thought that they were doing the right thing, even if that had terrible ends. Like you always want to improve. So I guess in my mind, the difference between utopianism and just idealism is we can make society better. Utopianism is like we can make it perfect. But since it's never going to be perfect, you're going to have to institute terrible means to get there. And then I was curious, kind of comparing the American Revolution, which, as you said, was rooted more in realism, to the French Revolution, which ended a lot more messily and with less stability than the American Revolution. Would you say the French Revolution was based on more utopianism than the American Revolution?
At least it put it out there more. Let's say that these ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Then yes, I think you're absolutely right on that. They became the reality had to be made to fit the ideology, at least as far as the ones who advocated this seriously thought. The problem, of course, one of the problems is that human nature doesn't go away. And there are those that profess certain ideals, but ultimately are driven by their own passions and their own human nature, which ultimately, the framers would say, is very much focused towards gaining power over others. Whereas the American Revolution was, to the extent there was an ideology, it was more one based on recapturing older sense of relations between the individual and the government rather than instituting. It was in that sense, we might call it, not in a political sense, but in that sense, a conservative revolution versus the French Revolution, which was not. It was a progressive or radical, forward-looking. But that's been one of the things that comes up with these writers that look towards these idealized versions of society and social arrangements, is that, I mentioned a minute ago, that if the reality and the ideology clash, there's something wrong with the reality, and it's the reality that must be changed, not the ideology. Okay. Whereas for the framers, I think, went the other way.
I've never heard it put like that. Wow, say that again. If reality doesn't match up with your
reality
ideology,
and ideology or theory clash, the problem is with reality, not with ideology or theory, because we're starting from our preconception, holistic theory. This is the way things are. And then obviously, if somebody doesn't agree with this, there's something wrong with them. It's that reality must be changed. They must be changed. Not that there might be something wrong with our ideas that we need to tweak.
Fascinating. Yeah, when we see our ideology or our worldview as unchanging, that's kind of the thing that Constituting America tries to emphasize in like our civil civic conversations, that you always have to go into any conversation with the mind frame that you could change your opinion if the facts don't support it, not change the facts if they don't support your opinion. And then, of course, there has to be a balance between utopianism, but also in other ways, we can't be too realist. Like we can't say that society is going to be how it is. We can't change it. We can't make it better, since there are many issues in society. So what would your advice be to maybe a leader or just to all of us for how to balance the need for change or the optimism of believing the future can be better without falling into those utopian traps?
Sure. I would simply refer to a quote from Federalist 6, that aphorism, "Let experience, the least fallible guide of human opinions, be appealed to for an answer to these inquiries," right? Don't try to change too much. It's just deal with the problem at hand. And yes, we all have certain ideas. Some are more oriented towards individual liberty, some more towards equality. There's that old tension. So ideology and ideas don't go away. And certainly one can improve. But number one, let experience be the guide is what I would tell the leader. To individuals, I would say, start by working on yourself. As Voltaire said, cultivate your own garden. That's where happiness starts. So that'd be the advice I would give. People try to, it's when you try to go too far, do too much too quickly, that problems arise. You're absolutely right. There's no reason not to try to improve a problem, right? But it's how you do it that becomes the issue. The poor will always be with you, for one reason, because it's definitional, but for one, because that's just going to happen for a number of reasons. So that doesn't mean you can't, there aren't certain things you can do to try to alleviate some of those problems.
Thank you so much. And then finally, it seems to me that a lot of religions are based in utopianism, mine included, this belief that there is kind of an end where humans can be purified or be perfect, like through divine intervention. So I'm curious if you could, I guess, talk about the difference between like religious utopianism and then more political utopianism. Do you think one is more valid than the other? Or just
I'm not
like
a theologian,
between the two?
so I'm not a theologian, so I'm very loath to wade into that too much. If I were to answer, it's just very general. But that can manifest itself. I think the point you may be getting at is the same impetus in human behavior to be found there in religious realm and in the political realm. And I think there's a lot to what you say. I suppose the difference is this, that if you stay with the basic teachings that yes, there will be a heaven at the end that you can go to, this ideal state, then that's one thing. If you try to create heaven on earth, given our human fallibilities, it becomes something else, right? Now, you may not believe in God, you may not believe in heaven and hell, and then that's something I'm not going to wade into. But if you do believe in that, then you also believe in the omniscience, omnipotence, and perfect morality of God. And that God is capable of things that we are not capable of, and we shouldn't try to imitate God on earth. The problem is, if too often people that come, well, I mean, I don't want to insult people here, that cultures that seek to impose a paradise on earth come from a more atheistic perspective. And I'm thinking here, everybody, Pol Pot, Mao, Stalin, and so on. Now, again, I'm not saying that there can't be religious enthusiasts who seek to create these kinds of human systems and create problems. But I think there is a difference there in perception about, where will this perfect state arise? Will it be on earth or somewhere else?
Thank you. And as you were saying before, I think it's about like the means you use to achieve the ends kind of makes all the difference, because, just like political utopianism, crimes have been committed in the name of religion that doesn't have anything to do with the religion itself, but the means you would go to achieve that utopia. We always need to be confronting that impulse in ourselves to see, you can't have your sights only on the horizon. You need to see what you're doing now. So this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. And now I'll pass on to Jewel.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Loud and clear.
All right. Very good. So it's cool to hear. St. Thomas More was my home parish, so cool to hear his name on the podcast. It's interesting because when you think about utopianism, you touched on it a little bit, but there was a great debate in Eastern philosophy between whether humans were born good or evil. And one of my favorite college classes was actually taught. It was an Eastern thought class, and the Christians had a different solution to that idea. We were born good, but we had a fallen nature. I think that thinking about the founding fathers, whether or not they were practicing Christians or not, it's hard to deny that the Judeo-Christian ethic is contained within our founding documents. Now, thinking about that in the frame of utopianism, if man has a flaw, then it's as you said, we can't we can't necessarily make the perfect world on earth. But if man can achieve some higher type of enlightenment, then maybe we can. Do you think that is? Do you think that today many of us believe that we can individually reach some level where we could bring about utopianism because we've been enlightened? And certainly wouldn't use that language, but that's what it would mean.
I would say there is no human capacity to do that. And I'm going to go back to, I couldn't hear everything that you said very well, but I think I got the gist of it. Going back in Western thought, that's what I'm familiar with, not particularly with Eastern thought. But there's been a long strand that says you really don't know, and you can't be happy, and you can't ultimately know until basically you're about to die. Because it takes that continuous growth and that experience over a long period of time. You don't have that when you're 20. You don't have that when you're 30. You don't have that when you're 40. Now we're getting closer to my age, so I'm going to stop there. I think that's true, and we never get to that perfection. I don't think through our efforts we can get to that level of knowledge that would allow us to say, yes, we can, we're smart enough, we're rational enough to create that ideal society on Earth. And going back to the framers, that's, I think, their perspective. It's that we can't achieve that, and if we try, we're going to create, the cure is going to be worse than the disease. Madison literally says that at one point. So I don't think we can get that to that stage of enlightenment, but that's my perspective. And by the way, the idea that man has fallen is in that sense was literally traceable to any number of schools of thought at the time, especially Plato and his disciples. It became Platonism, where the soul literally fell from the earth, from the great good to the earth, and was condemned to be on the earth for a while, and then all the soul wanted to be released, to rejoin, to rise again and rejoin the great good. So this is not an uncommon view in the West.
Do you have any, what could we read of the Founding Fathers, where you've mentioned Madison a few times? Where could we read their discussions where they're talking about this, not to make utopia, not to try to make utopia, the dangers of utopianism? And I know it may not be always explicit, but do you have any suggestions?
Well, I would go to I was going to the Federalist papers. So, I mean, I can give you particular citations where there might be some of that. I was reading from Federalist 6, where Hamilton talks about this. And by the way, what's just a slight digression there, one of the sort of utopian idealized views of things that he critiques there is that, and you may have heard this even today, is that commercial republics don't go to war with each other. So let's have a lot of trade ties, because we won't go to war because the economics will override everything. So republics don't go to war with each other. And he says, that's nonsense, right? World War I was a bunch of sort of republican governments that had all kinds of commercial ties with each other, and they ended up in a huge slaughter. He goes back to, Hamilton goes back to Carthage and Rome as examples. So these ideological assumptions that just don't really work when put up against the facts. So Federalist 6, Federalist, to me, the biggest sort of sources of that would be Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. So the quotes that I gave you here, but it comes up in other context as well. Madison brings it up again in Federalist 52. He He talks about it in Federalist 37 when he talked about the difficulties the convention had. And he says, okay, wouldn't it have been, isn't it sort of amazing? Not wouldn't have been. Isn't it sort of amazing that in order to deal with these sort of things, we were able to go away from our preconceived notions of how things might ideally work and came up with these compromises. And then he actually alludes to, given the difficulties we had in being able to come down to sort of practical compromise, to him that said, there must have been the hand of the Almighty involved in this and guiding us. Because we couldn't have done this ourselves because of our own fallibilities. So there's a lot of that runs through there, these various essays. Beyond that, I wouldn't be able to point to any particular letters or books.
That's certainly enough. I think that, and we did go over some of the Federalist papers. And so I kind of knew what you might answer, but I definitely wanted to get where some of those citations were from, because it's incredible how much of our current day discussion are arguments that were had before, that we have such a wealth of knowledge that if we go back to the well and do not try to always recreate the wheel, then possibly we can build on those ideas. If you ask an everyday American, they probably have heard the word utopia and they may pick up what it means. But to know that it was actually defamed in the Federalist Papers and thoroughly discussed as at some point having to be dealt with as a serious idea and having to be said that that we should not attempt it is something that I don't think most of us would know. And those papers are just such a source of just a wealth of knowledge that I'm thankful that you pointed some out that we can go back to. Think about this.
And it's not just the Federalist Papers. There's a guy, Robert Yates in New York, who went to the Philadelphia Convention and left early because he didn't like what was being produced. He became a sort of moderate anti-Federalist, wrote a lot of essays under the pen name Brutus. And when he critiques what the Constitution does, he's also constantly referring to human nature. Like, he's saying, look, the problem with the Supreme Court is going to be that they're human beings. And like every other human being in politics, they're going to try to increase their power. So it's Hamilton, don't start talking about how they're judges and they're these independent decision makers. So the anti-federalists also critique this, not always on grounds of, well, this doesn't meet our conception of a republic, but also very much on these very practical, pragmatic grounds.
And here's a kind of a harder question. I know you said you're not a theologian, but hopefully this is a little bit more philosophical. The question of human nature. If you do deny that there is a human nature totally, then is there any argument against attempting utopia?
Is there any argument what?
Then against attempting to create utopia.
Oh. If there's no human nature, if everybody is a complete tabula rasa, the argument would be, yes, we can create this utopia because we can simply do it purely through indoctrination. But there's going to be a human nature driven in part through evolution. And if nothing else, if I want to be really rudimentary about this, there are going to be biological imperatives that are going to shape how you act and how you think. Leave aside brain structures and those kinds of things that could happen through, heredity or through influence in the womb or what have you. But the old nature versus nurture debate that we can go on and on. But I think you're right that if we are simply blank slates entirely and only influenced by our environment, then yes, people could try to create their vision of utopia. Now, their vision of utopia might be different from the next person's vision of utopia, but that's another issue, right? So.
All right. I know we have to end the show a little early so we can get to the audience questions. Sorry about the wind out here. It got really windy right when I started talking. But just as closing, I think you probably won't be surprised, but even the term human nature in popular circles is not always something that's accepted.
Correct.
So let's get to the audience questions.
Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you, Tova, for your great questions. And we do have quite a few audience questions here. We're going to start with Phil Kamen, who says, how would you compare utopianism with the framers' concept of a more perfect union?
Well, it is kind of interesting to talk about more perfect. I make a joke about this when I teach my con law classes, but the idea that something can be perfect and then more perfect. So I assume this is simply a rhetorical device, that they weren't trying to, really thinking that they were creating a perfect government. And indeed, Madison, in one of the papers, trying to remember which one it was in the 40s, is talking about, the best way to look at what we're producing is we're just tweaking the Articles of Confederation a little bit. That's all we're doing. So we're not starting a whole new ideal project here. So I would say that was more of a rhetorical flourish than anything else.
Okay. And then Linda Bartlett asks about George Mason, and she says, can the professor discuss the contribution of George Mason? I read a quote that made the most significant contribution. I read a quote that he made the most significant contribution for someone who did not sign the Constitution that resulted from the convention. But then she goes on to ask, would Mason have been considered utopian at the time, but then what he wanted was added? Do those amendments then provide an outlet for the need for utopia? And it is ironic, the amendment's principles are what we were fighting for today.
Okay, I am not an expert on George Mason, but I think you're right that he had a lot of influence on the Constitution itself. He was instrumental in drafting many of the provisions of the Constitution. The reason he left was because the convention would not budge on adding a Bill of Rights, which is what he was pushing for quite a bit. And so he left and stated his opposition to the final document based really on that absence of a Bill of Rights. So he was instrumental both in raising the consciousness or being a catalyst, let's put it this way, for the eventual adoption of a Bill of Rights, raising awareness of what he saw as the need for the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the sequence of state conventions that approved the Constitution, they included proposals for amendments, especially for provisions that ended up in the Bill of Rights. So his ideas people could coalesce around, but he was very important in the actual drafting of the document. Much of what's in there can be traced to proposals that he had, or at least language that he proposed in furtherance of other people's proposals.
Well, thank you. And Linda's a great Virginian, and I love it that she brought up George Mason, who actually just lives down a few neighborhoods over from me, or his house. George Mason's house is down a little ways from me. So thank you for that, Linda. And then finally, John Chambers asks, big states versus small states, factions and Madisonian democracy. Can you address how a multiplicity of factions keep the republic balanced?
Yes, and this was one of those examples of, hey, let's be realistic rather than try to deal with this from some ideological perspective. Madison addresses the issue of factions. He says that's just the way politics works. If you have a group of people, factions are going to develop that are near each other, around each other a lot. Factions are going to develop. I mean, I sort of have some experience with this. Think about sibling rivalry. If you have, I had, or I still have, fortunately, 7 children, and you see factions develop, and the factions shift depending upon which toy is wanted or what, you know, the choice for food is going to be. So they're not uniform. And so now you put this into a polity, and factions are going to develop. The problem that Madison sees in Federalist 10 is factions are a reflection of human nature. They're a reflection of the human drive for power. They're a reflection of what he calls the inequality of natural inequality among people. That yes, we may all be equal in a very metaphysical sense or religious sense, but we're not equal in our capacities. And so because of our natural inequalities, differences are going to develop as far as wealth is concerned. We have differences in intellect, which will allow us to try to achieve power over others more successfully. So you're going to have these factions. They're driven by human nature. So there are 2 things you can do. You can either try to deal with the causes of faction, or you can try to control the effects of faction. And he says, if you try to control the causes of faction, you're fighting against human nature. And the cures, that's where the language, the cure is going to be worse than the disease, because you're going to have to basically force equality of result on people. And that's not going to work because, again, we're not equal in our passions and our reason and so on and so forth. So the best thing we can do is to try to be practical about it, as practical as we can be, to control the effects of faction. And one way to try to control the effects of faction is to disperse different groups across a broader perspective so that you don't have permanent factions develop. In a small town, the danger is that more permanent or long-term factions will develop. Because and after 20 years, we don't even know why we're divided this way. It's just that we've always been this way, right? The Hatfields and the McCoys. But if you have a large enough group, then you have these different interests in different parts of the country, different religious groups, different economic concerns, and so on and so forth, that you don't get these permanent factions in the Congress. And that's what Madison was getting at there. With the dispersal of factions across the Union.
Well, and John has an interesting comment to add on to what you're saying. He says, also thought the faction you belong to is called the people, and other factions are called special interests, and we balance each other out. So
True.
Good. Well, Professor Knipprath, we want to thank you so much for joining us today at stepping in here at the last minute. And we know you've got to leave a little bit early. When you were talking about factions, it led into another one of our episodes that we have coming up, which is avoiding the pitfalls of partisanship. We're going to be talking a lot more about factions and talking about George Washington's farewell address, where he warned us about factions. Mm-hmm. So, and next week, we're going to be talking about avoiding the pitfalls of anarchy with Professor Gordon Lloyd of Pepperdine. So we're going to let you go so that you can make your appointment on time. And we just want to thank you so much. And Jewel, and I don't know if we still have Tova with us. Tova may have had to go, but any parting comments, Jewel?
No, just thanks for another great show about another great topic, really.
Well, thank you for having me.
And so I don't know if Tova may have had to go because she does this a lot during her lunch break at school. So I know she'd love to say goodbye as well, but we're going to let you go. And if the audience wants to stay on for just a second. So bye, Professor Knipprath. Aubrey, we're going to ask if you'll bring up the auction one more time, because we would love, since we ended a little early today, we want to encourage the audience to go on our auction check it out, help us make our goal. This is one of the most important fundraisers that we do every year. And we're in so much demand more than ever to get to schools. We're down in the Houston area, just north of Houston, all week this week, speaking to Bailey Middle School and Springwoods Middle School and Spring Leadership Academy. And we were just in Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago, and we're in Oklahoma last week. So it's these items on the auction benefit our Constitution education programs. They help us bring these podcasts to you every week, but we really need to hit our goal in this auction, which is around $22,000, I believe. We're almost halfway there. So we've got about 3 days left. A lot of really cool things. We got a Constitution quest game on there that Aubrey just scrolled by, all those great pins we showed you at the beginning of the program, some wonderful books, great tours. We've got a tour Mount Vernon that I love to do with our auction winners. So please spend some time, explore it and bid. And we look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you.